Welcome to Perspectives, a special presentation of the Power of the Patient Project. Today's guest is Robyn Goldberg. And now, here is your host, Charlotte Grinnell.
Okay. Hi, I'm Charlotte Grinnell, and welcome to Perspectives presented by the Power of the Patient Project. My guest today is Robyn Goldberg. Robyn is a registered dietitian nutritionalist, certified eating disorder registered dietitian supervisor, a certified intuitive eating counselor, and a health at every size clinician. For the last 23 years, Robyn has had a private practice in Beverly Hills, California, where she specializes in medical conditions, eating disorders, dual diagnosis, pre-pregnancy nutrition in women seeking fertility treatment. Robyn has been quoted as an expert in various publications, including the New York Times, Huffington Post, Diabetes Forecast, Shape Magazine, Fitness, Oxygen, Life and Style, Natural Solutions, Beverly Hills Weekly, Today's Dietitian, and most recently in Vogue. In addition, Robyn has also served as an eating disorder specialist on the nationally televised show The Insider and an expert on the Associated Press. Welcome, Robyn. Thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation is especially relevant right now with Eating Disorder Education and Awareness Week coming up.
Absolutely. I appreciate you inviting me, Charlotte. It's great to be here.
Great. Could you start by telling us why it's so important to bring awareness to to eating disorders?
Well, the first thing is I think there's so many perceptions about what kinds of people have eating disorders, and eating disorders impact all ages, all genders, all body shapes and sizes. And unfortunately, the way media has portrayed it has been one small side of it. As I would say, many people that have eating disorders look quote unquote normal, live in larger bodies, are non-gender conforming, are males, are older adults. So I think it's important to be able to inform the public that any person you know that is living could have an eating disorder. And if they don't have an eating disorder, perhaps they have disordered eating and thinking.
Definitely. And would you start by explaining the intuitive eating approach that you usually use with your clients?
Sure. So, and I just wanted to say the other reason that I think it's important to be able to inform people about eating disorders is, the prevalence of eating disorders has actually doubled from 2013 to 2018 as opposed to 2000 and 2006. So it's definitely on the rise. And I wanted to say that to you, and I'm happy to answer your intuitive eating question as well. To answer your second question about eating disorders, or I should say about intuitive eating, many people think like, oh, is this another diet? And really, when I like to talk about intuitive eating, you think back to when we're babies, when we're small children, that we're all born and blessed with this internal wisdom to be able to, eat not only when we're hungry and stop when we're, satiated, but through the aging process until kind of diet culture takes over our own ideas, we're able to make food choices freely without guilt, shame, remorse, and have it be a constant game of counting, computing, weighing. And really, with intuitive eating, I'll hear clients say, well, perhaps I'm not doing it, quote unquote, correctly. And there's no right or wrong way. Really getting to a place of learning how to be mindful and conscious with whatever food choice we make is what I like to help clients learn how to achieve. But most importantly, it's also about achieving satisfaction, which, like the most recent edition of Intuitive Eating, the fourth edition, has come out. And there is, quite a bit of emphasis that really satisfaction is one of the most important, concepts. And a person could be filled up on what I would call air food, bulk food, vegetables, and they'll say, oh, I'm content, I'm not hungry. But then you start to think about food pretty soon thereafter, perhaps an hour, 2 hours later, as opposed to if an individual had a sandwich where you're able to have a carbohydrate in the form of bread, you're able to have the protein source, the meat, and being able to add some fat. Perhaps I'm having some mayonnaise or avocado. I think being physically filled up and emotionally satiated are very, very important, especially so a person is not consumed with when am I eating, what am I eating, and having so many lingering thoughts centered around food and body and such.
Yeah, and I think you touched on this, and something that I've found interesting as I've, learned more about eating disorders and educating myself on it is that people have such different emotions and feelings attached to eating that's so different from everyone else. So you never kind of know what relationship people have with food. And I think that that's probably a big thing that you do, is kind of working on the relationship that people have with food and how that affects them.
Very much so, Charlotte. I think there's so much about a person's lived experience, where they are from culturally, the different, rituals within their country, origin, where they're from. I mean, there's so much how really we don't think about that. And it's important to be able to bring each person's lived experience to the table, literally, because that shapes who we are as people, the food choices that we make, when we eat, why we eat. And I think the problem is diet culture ignores all of that and basically states if you're not eating a certain way or approaching your meals in this particular timeline, then it's wrong. And that's when people start to second guess and doubt whatever choices they are making.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And so you wrote a book called The Eating Disorder Trap that kind of combines the latest research as well as the knowledge that you've gathered working in nutrition for over 2 decades. What was kind of the main message that you hoped to get across to readers through this book?
Well, I wanted to write a book, Charlotte, that anyone could understand, that you did not have to be a clinician in the field or have a PhD, where it was really understandable. And my main message in writing this book is it's never too late to get help. There are so many wonderful clinicians all over, not just the United States, but internationally, that specialize in body image, eating disorders, and really it takes a village. It takes a team to be able to get help. And sometimes too, even like with the pandemic, I mean, I've seen it's just rampant. Although individuals may have had challenges before, when you think about like the whole, premise of the eating disorder voice, and for, those listeners that don't know what it is, and I do talk about this in my book, is when an individual, let's say, is restricting or they're compulsively exercising or they're binging, there's this little voice that is the narrator. It's sort of like, you've got the angel and the devil. You have these two opposing voices, and the eating disorder voice doesn't want the individual to succeed. The individual is constantly judging and second guessing what they're doing because the voice wants them to fail. So in my book, I really lay out all the steps in how to not only obtain support, but even if they are reading something like my book or listening to my podcast, which I started, the Eating Disorder Trap podcast, which is on iTunes and Spotify, realizing that it doesn't matter if you've been engaging in your behaviors for 1 year or for 50 years, that it's never too late to get help.
And could you elaborate a little bit more when you said that the relationship with COVID and eating disorders and how that's kind of increasing?
Yeah, well, through the pandemic, and the research has shown mental illness, mental health, depression, anxiety has certainly skyrocketed, and certainly those with eating disorders, because it's a very isolating time. I've had clients say, oh, I love this because I don't have to see people. I'm not, being invited out, and I'm not being questioned meals. But then there's this, whoever's in your bubble, perhaps, being questioned, judged, having eyes on you, maybe it's fewer. So for many that have already isolated, this has been something that they have felt safe with, but it's certainly brought up a lot of anxiety. This has come up with many of my clients, immersing back into the world, being able to go out to a restaurant. Like in Los Angeles, as of 1 week, now there's outdoor dining in not all restaurants, but it's just been curbside. So the idea of going out, going somewhere. I mean, my husband and I were discussing, I have not been out in a year to a restaurant, takeout, and I'm actually fully vaccinated now, and he's this week, and we're like, wow, we're going to go out. This is like exciting. So I think for those with eating disorders, it's been a very trying time because we can't control everything that's going on in the world, but it's like, well, I can control what I'm eating, when I'm eating, and everything centered around it, because I can't control that I have school on Zoom or what's happening in the world and politics, but this has been something that unfortunately many have latched onto because it comes from a place of control, since it's not about the food.
Yeah, definitely. That definitely makes sense. And finally, can you share your thoughts on a major issue in this country, which is the stigmas attached to eating disorders? And so, in your opinion, what can be done about it, and how can people who need help recognize it, accept it, and most importantly, find the right help?
I think from a stigma perspective, it's really helpful when there's individuals that use their voice, their platform, and say, I'm in treatment for an eating disorder, or I'm in recovery, that doesn't look like the standard, I would say, person, perhaps Charlotte, that resembles you or I, because I think, we oftentimes hear it's a woman, a Caucasian woman with thin privilege. And so it's really way more than that. I mean, I have clients who are like, Robyn, anyone that's spoken about, I can't relate to them. They don't have my body shape. They can't understand my background. And I think having more and more voices come forward to be able to share that they currently or have had these struggles, in addition to, there's more and more resources, books I'm referring to, that are showing all bodies, all cultures. And that's important too, because otherwise people have these ideas. Like, I have many individuals that are empty nesters, that are Medicare patients, and I actually lobbied on Capitol Hill for really having people see what's going on with those in the Medicare population, because we don't realize that the aging generation, they're actually the fastest growing group to have eating disorders, whether they've had a child go off to college, they've gone through a divorce, they've had a death, something traumatic. So for the Affordable Cares Act, it's realizing, like, your mother or grandmother or grandfather or dad could have an eating disorder too. And I think really broadening the scope of knowledge about who this can be impacted, because no one's immune from getting an eating disorder.
Definitely. And for those who, maybe are affected by stigmas that they've heard about mental health, about eating disorders, what would kind of be your advice of, asking for help and kind of putting aside what they've heard or what they think about eating disorders and kind of asking for help and getting it?
I think people are always going to have opinions. Unfortunately, Charlotte, we oftentimes hear about people's negative experiences. But I always like to say, when your life is focused on just this and you're finding your world is becoming narrower and narrower, that might be a time to say, you know what, I'm going to reach out for help. I mean, there's so many clinicians willing and competent to support someone with an eating disorder. And I think, like, they could go on to, it's called IFED, IFEDD. I'm the Los Angeles ambassador for IFED. It's the International Federation of Eating Disorder Dietitians. So all dietitians like me all over the country are on this site, and you type in your zip code, and that could be a place to start, because oftentimes I will hear people say, well, I don't want to reach out to a therapist. I'll start with a registered dietitian, knowing that the registered dietitian specializes in food and body issues. But to be able to say, if a person was able to change, these aspects on their own, there wouldn't be clinicians such as myself that do what we do. And I think it's a really courageous move to reach out for help, and I definitely support it.
Perfect. This was such an insightful conversation. I'm so happy that we got to have it before eating disorder education and awareness week coming up. So this was a really important conversation to always have, but especially right now. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to have this discussion with us.
Anytime, Charlotte. Thanks again for having me.